Now, Dinah, you've been in the EDI space for quite some time now. I know whenever I hear that phrase, I personally think it's just a polite way of saying you're old, but let's not think about that.
Which I am.
But just what's your take right now, given the current discourse around EDI? What has changed?
Well, I mean, it's become an increasingly politicized term, number one. And I think, the pendulum, if you look historically, there's been a lot of legislation. I think there's some lawyers in the room. There's been a lot of, great regulation, legislation that has really focused on diversity in the workplace. We've got Equal Pay Act, we have civil rights, starting back in the 60s, and frankly, it even happened earlier than that. And so there's been steady progress made over the last, 40, 50 years. And I think the advent of, more diversity programming within corporations, within schools. And then we had 2020 and pandemic hit, and then we had the George Floyd murder. And I think at that point, it was sort of an awakening, and there was a lot of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. There was a lot of questioning about what had happened. And, the pendulum started to swing in one direction, and there was great enthusiasm in many companies. Some companies had been doing this work for a long time because it had been steadily, the focus had been there for 50 years. But some companies took this as an opportunity to, put their programming in place, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of money started flowing into DEI and a lot of work. And in many cases, companies, I think, began to do things that some people perceived were more performative. And then you started to get a little bit of a backlash. So, the pendulum went this way, lots of programming, et cetera. Pendulum started to swing the opposite direction. It became highly politicized. Terms were being thrown around. And I think now we've come to a spot where, it's highly political. But what our research is showing, despite all the politicization and certainly the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, and admissions decision got people, jangled a little bit. But despite all of that, our research is showing that companies are still very committed to the work. But what has happened is, because the words have become very divisive, the focus is perhaps shifting. The focus is shifting away from using words. Some companies are backing off on the terminology, but they're really not backing off on a lot of the funding. Most companies. Our research showed that we research quarterly with CHROs, and we also do an annual research with the entire C-suite. And it was really interesting. CHROs, none of them said they were backing off on their funding or commitment to the program. 62% said that they were still very focused on creating diverse and inclusive and equitable workplaces in their companies. And this was, 192 CHROs that we surveyed just at the end of this past year. It was interesting to me that the survey that we did then with the entire C-suite, where we asked them issues across the board, not just DEI, but what were their concerns for 2024? What are they focused on? They all talked about culture and focusing on attracting and retaining talent. CEOs. We asked about them to dig deeper and how are you going to do that? And they talked about, again, focusing on culture, focusing on getting the best talent, focusing on, enabling new skills and really allowing technology to fuel some of that. Hardly any of them wanted to even speak to DEI programs. But embedded in those responses were the fact that they were looking to continue to broaden the scope of their workforce. Many were concerned about labor shortages, which gets to why you should be concerned about DEI. So I think what's happened now is the pendulum swung one way after the George Floyd murder. We had Black Lives Matter. People got very enthusiastic. There was some backlash, concern, SCOTUS happened. And, it became highly politicized. And now I think things are starting to come back. And perhaps we're at an equilibrium. But the focus really has turned to how do we do this work, and maybe how do we change some of the words.
So, when you talk to the CEOs of the companies and things like that, what was the business case that they put forward? Because we talk a lot about, diversity of thought and how you make decisions, but did they actually have a solid business case behind why they're putting this much effort into it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's several things. Number one, I mentioned labor shortages. We're, historically, hot labor market despite many, concerns over a slowing economy. Our chief economist has now backed off of saying there's going to be a recession in the first quarter, but she does, project slowing of the economy, certainly in the U.S. And frankly, we would say that perhaps in Europe and other parts of the world, we have hit a bit of a recession. So, but the labor markets, at least in the U.S. and in many markets, continue to be very tight. So that's one thing. If you look demographically at what is happening, in many countries, we have an aging population. And so, you have people leaving the workforce. Here in the US, it's the baby boomers. They're leaving the workforce. Many companies are focused on how do we, do the knowledge transfer? How do we retain them? How do we be creative about keeping them in the workforce so that we can have a very orderly transition? You've got the rise of Gen Zers who have very different perspectives on what they expect from their workplace, what their expectations are about the mission, the values that a company espouses. And they don't want words, they want to see actions in terms of how companies are behaving. So if you want to attract the best Gen Zers, and Gen Zers are quite diverse. If you look at the diversity overall of our country, at least in the US, we're going to be a majority minority country by 2045, or, maybe some people say 2050, but we're going to have a majority of minority people in the workplace, running the country basically. And so CEOs say, number one, we have labor shortages. We want to make sure we're fishing in the entire sea, that we're getting as many people, diverse people from around the world working for us. Number two, they're concerned about the changing demographics and the shifting mindset of the younger generation. And I think number three, they know that, just as the demographics of the workforce are changing, the demographics of their consumers are changing. So they want to make sure that they are understanding and have a diverse workforce that reflects the diversity of the consumers that they are selling to. And I think fourth, and maybe this, I'm not doing these in any order because this is, this one is actually very, very important. Many of them talk about if they need to innovate, and many of them are in a transformative phase of their companies. They're trying to transform how they, leverage technology. They have to, create better digital customer experiences. They need a different kind of workforce, and they need a diverse workforce that can bring that diversity of skills to the workplace, that diversity of perspectives, that perhaps understanding of the different, segments of the population that they want to be selling to. So if they really want to understand their marketplace, they need that diversity of thought, and they need that diversity of thought actually to spark creativity and innovation. So they've bought into it. I think what they're concerned about is how do we now make sure that we're doing it in a way that actually generates the results that we're looking for, and that it ties back to our business strategy. Because metrics have always been a little loose when it comes to DEI programs. Certainly in 2020, when there were billions of dollars flowing into DEI programs, and you had not as much accountability in terms of what was the real impact of those programs, what really happened, did we change behaviors, did we actually focus on the things that we need to focus on in order to create a more diverse, inclusive, and an organization that creates that sense of belonging and safe space for people to do their best work.
With that, I wanted to say thank you very, very much, Diana, for coming here and sharing your thoughts with us.